Before Cuba became synonymous with sugar, before the Caribbean became one of the most important centers of the Atlantic slave system, Spain had already begun building the machinery that would make it possible. And it began with something that might sound surprisingly small, a license. In the early 16th century, Spain began introducing enslaved Africans into its Caribbean territories. By 1518, Africans were being transported into Spanish America in increasingly organized numbers. At first, the Spanish crown did not create one enormous system. Instead, individual merchants were granted permission to transport one or more enslaved people across the Atlantic. But this was only the beginning, because Spain soon discovered that there was enormous money to be made by controlling the trade itself. And by 1528, a new system was taking shape, the asiento. An asiento was essentially a contract granted by the Spanish crown, giving an individual, company or foreign power the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spain's American colonies. It turned the transportation of human beings into a licensed commercial enterprise. And Spain did not necessarily have to carry out the trade itself. It could simply grant someone else the right to do it, and collect the profits and taxes along the way. Portuguese merchants became involved, then the English, then the Dutch, then the French. One European power after another entered a system that was becoming increasingly international. The Spanish colonies of the Americas were now connected to slave trading networks stretching across much of the African coastline. In the early stages of this trade, one of the most important sources was the region known broadly as Guinea. This enormous stretch of West Africa extended from around the Senegal River toward the Cape of Palms. Captives were taken from different African societies and transported toward the coast, where European merchants purchased them for shipment across the Atlantic. But the geography of the trade did not remain fixed. As European demand increased, the network expanded southward. By the second half of the 17th century, Angola had become increasingly important. The Atlantic was becoming a vast commercial system. Ships moved westward carrying manufactured goods. They returned carrying commodities produced in the colonies, and human beings who had been forced into the system. The destinations were spread across Spanish America. Captives arrived at ports such as Cartagena. They were transported through Panama and into South America. They reached regions around the Rio de la Plata. They entered territories corresponding to parts of modern-day Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, Colombia, and elsewhere. But one destination was becoming increasingly important, the Caribbean. And at the center of that transformation stood an island that would eventually become one of the most notorious plantation societies in the Atlantic world, Cuba. The story of slavery in the Spanish Caribbean cannot be separated from one commodity: sugar. Sugar was becoming enormously profitable, but producing it on an industrial scale required something plantations could never have enough of: labor. Cutting cane, planting, harvesting, transporting, processing, working the mills, maintaining the plantations. Every stage demanded exhausting physical labor, and as the demand for sugar increased, so did the demand for enslaved Africans. The Caribbean was gradually being transformed. What had once been a collection of colonial territories was becoming an interconnected plantation economy. And Cuba was positioned perfectly for this expansion. Its geography made it strategically valuable. Its fertile land made it suitable for agriculture. Its location made it an important point in Atlantic commerce. And eventually, its sugar industry would make Cuba one of the largest destinations for enslaved Africans in the Spanish world. But then something unexpected happened. In 1762, Britain went to war with Spain as part of the wider global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. British forces attacked Cuba, and in August 1762, Havana fell to the British. For Cuba, the consequences were extraordinary. The British occupation lasted less than a year, but during that short period, the island's commercial system was opened much more aggressively to British merchants. And with commerce came something else, enslaved Africans. Thousands were brought into Cuba during the British occupation. Estimates suggest that approximately 4,000 African captives arrived during this brief period. Think about the scale of that number. An occupation lasting less than a year produced an influx that represented an extraordinary share of the enslaved population imported into Cuba during the preceding centuries. The British were showing just how quickly Cuba's plantation economy could expand when commercial restrictions were loosened. And the Spanish authorities were watching. When Spain regained control of Cuba, it did not simply return the island to its previous economic model. Instead, the lesson had been learned. Cuba could become enormously profitable. The Spanish crown began encouraging wider commercial development throughout its American colonies, and the consequences would be enormous. For centuries, the Spanish crown had attempted to regulate the supply of enslaved Africans through licenses and contracts. But in 1789, Spain took a major step. It introduced a policy allowing much freer slave trading with its American colonies. The restrictions that had previously limited participation were being dismantled, and once the gates opened wider, the traffic increased. British merchants, French merchants, Dutch merchants, Spanish merchants, Portuguese merchants, international commercial networks now had greater opportunities to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America. The result was a dramatic expansion of slavery. In regions corresponding to modern-day Venezuela and Colombia, the enslaved population grew. The Caribbean islands of Puerto Rico and Cuba became increasingly dependent on enslaved labor. And Cuba was about to enter an entirely new era. The transformation of Cuba was not simply about the arrival of more enslaved Africans, it was about the creation of an economic system built around them. Sugar plantations expanded, production increased, ports became busier, merchants accumulated fortunes, European capital flowed into the island, and behind the wealth was an expanding population of enslaved workers. The plantation became more than a place where crops were grown. It became the center of an entire economic machine. Landowners needed labor, merchants needed cargo, ships needed profitable routes, banks and investors needed returns, colonial governments needed taxes, and the Atlantic trading system supplied the people who were forced to make all of this possible. Human beings had become the labor force powering an increasingly global economy. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Cuba, because the Spanish slave trade was never confined to one island. Captives were entering Spanish America through multiple ports and then being transported through colonial territories. Cartagena became one of the major gateways. Panama connected Atlantic commerce with the Pacific world. Buenos Aires became increasingly important. The Rio de la Plata region became part of the wider network. Across the northern coast of South America, enslaved Africans were being incorporated into colonial economies. And everywhere, the same basic logic prevailed. Labor created wealth. But this wealth was not distributed equally. The merchants accumulated fortunes. The plantation owners expanded their estates. The colonial authorities collected taxes. European commercial interests grew stronger, while the people at the bottom of the system paid the price with their freedom. What is important about this period is how ordinary the system had become within the structures of empire. The trade no longer depended simply on individual merchants deciding to transport captives. It was supported by governments, regulated through contracts, taxed by states, financed by merchants, protected by military power, and integrated into international commerce. The asiento had helped create the legal and commercial framework. Plantation agriculture created the demand. European shipping networks provided the transportation. African political and commercial networks became entangled in the supply of captives, and colonial governments turned the entire process into a source of revenue. This was no longer a temporary experiment. It was an institution. By the late 18th century, Cuba was moving rapidly toward becoming the largest slave colony in the Spanish-American world. Sugar was driving the transformation. The island's plantations expanded, the demand for workers intensified, and the Atlantic trade supplied thousands upon thousands of Africans. The demographic landscape of Cuba changed. African languages and cultures became deeply embedded in Cuban society. Religious traditions survived, music survived, foodways survived, family structures were rebuilt under impossible circumstances. And despite the violence of enslavement, African cultures did not simply disappear. They adapted, they survived, they transformed the societies into which enslaved Africans had been forced. The people who arrived in chains would leave an imprint on the Caribbean that could never be erased. But step back for a moment. The story we have followed begins in the early 16th century. At first, individual licenses, then asientos, then international competition, then plantation agriculture, then the expansion of sugar, and finally, a system operating across an entire empire. Spain had created a framework in which the movement of enslaved Africans became part of the normal machinery of colonial commerce. And other European powers were learning from it. Britain, France, the Netherlands, Portugal. Each would develop its own role in the expanding Atlantic economy. The competition between European powers was no longer simply about territory. It was about access to markets, access to plantations, access to shipping routes, access to labor, and ultimately, access to profit. By the end of the 18th century, the Atlantic world had been transformed. Africa was connected to Europe and the Americas through an enormous network of trade. Ships crossed the ocean carrying manufactured goods. They returned carrying sugar, tobacco, coffee, cotton, and other commodities. And in between those voyages came millions of human stories, stories of capture, separation, survival, resistance, and displacement. Cuba stood increasingly at the heart of this system. The island's sugar economy would continue expanding, the demand for enslaved labor would continue, and the consequences would extend far beyond the plantations themselves. Because slavery was not simply an economic institution. It reshaped demographics, it reshaped culture, it reshaped politics, it reshaped families, and it reshaped the identities of entire nations. The Atlantic slave system did not appear overnight. It was built piece by piece. A license here, a contract there, a new port, a new plantation, a new commercial agreement, a new shipment of captives. Until eventually, what had begun as a regulated trade became an enormous international system, and Cuba would become one of its most important centers. But there is another question we must now ask. What happened to the African societies supplying this expanding demand? Who was being captured? Who was selling? Who was resisting? How did wars and political upheavals change the flow of captives? And how did African kingdoms themselves become transformed by an Atlantic economy that was growing beyond their control? Because the story of the Atlantic slave trade is not only a story of ships crossing an ocean, it is a story of Africa, Europe, and the Americas becoming locked into a system that would change all three forever. And this was only the beginning. Please like and share the video to help support this channel. Subscribe for more videos on Forever Blessed History. Until next time.